cars now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the Trade Mart. I was on Stemmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way toward the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people heading up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Stemmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas. Let me quote to you this. And you'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin. This is from the United Press, from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife, Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital.
When you think about the vast amount of history that this world has been through, humans have only been around for what equates to the blink of an eye. History can bring us a lot of different feelings and emotions. Some things that have happened are downright shocking, terrible, and seem almost impossible to comprehend. Things that humans do to one another. There are also historical events that define not only countries, but sometimes generations. Those events that just stick with us. No matter who you are, you know the story of the assassination of United States President John F. Kennedy. He was shot in his car while waving to an adoring public in Dallas. He was shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. These facts seem cut and dry, right? But what if I was to tell you it wasn't? An event of such importance that it has spawned many different conspiracy theories. To get a true understanding of how these theories developed, we'll have to examine the events that led up to the 22nd of November and set the stage for the things surrounding both what happened and what came after. So grab a seat and get comfortable, because I'm Nick, and this is a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast, titled Conspiracy, the Assassination of John F. Kennedy. In November of 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy embarked on a trip to the state of Texas. The purpose of the trip was to raise more funding for his upcoming re-election campaign. Its other purpose was to repair political ties amongst many of the Democratic Party members in Texas who were currently involved in infighting. The trip to Texas was announced by the White House in September of 1963. Kennedy would arrive at Dallas Love Field, an airport just to the northwest of downtown Dallas. Only minutes after arrival, he would travel with his presidential motorcade in an open-top limousine in order to give him the most exposure possible to the public. The intent of the motorcade was to travel from the airfield to the Dallas Market Center, where Kennedy would meet with various civic and business leaders in Dallas. The motorcade departed the airfield around 11:30 with the purpose of taking a slow drive through downtown and arrive for lunch shortly after noon. The two people charged with planning of the trip were Special Agent Winston Lawson of the White House detail and Secret Service Agent Forrest Sorrells, who had previously taken the route, and in their professional opinion, it was the best way to go. Within the motorcade would be 3 vehicles. The first was an unmarked white Ford carrying Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry, Special Agent Lawson, Sheriff Bill Decker, and Secret Agent Sorrells. The second was carrying the president, JFK, a Lincoln 1961 Continental convertible. Accompanying Jack Kennedy were his wife Jackie, Agent Bill Greer, Roy Kellerman, as well as Governor John Connolly and his wife Nellie. The trail vehicle was a 1955 Cadillac convertible with the code name Halfback. It bore driver Agent Sam Kinney and Emery Roberts, as well as presidential aides Ken O'Donnell and Dave Powers, in addition, Agents George Hickey and Glenn Bennett. Also on the third vehicle, riding on the running boards, were Secret Service agents Clint Hill, Jack Reddy, Tim McIntyre, and Paul Landis. After arriving from Fort Worth on the 22nd of November, the president's motorcade would leave Love Field around 11:40. They were about 10 minutes ahead of schedule and were further delayed by 2 unplanned stops that were ordered by the president. There were tons of people in attendance, with estimated numbers being around 150 to 200,000 people. Around 12:30, the motorcade entered Dealey Plaza, a city park in the west end of Dallas. Nellie Connolly, the wife of the governor, turned to John and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." His reply would be the last words he would ever speak. "No, you certainly can't." The motorcade turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street as it prepared to enter the Stemmons Freeway. As the motorcade passed in front of the Texas School Book Depository, loud noises reported from outside the motorcade. Originally, they were thought to be firecrackers or a vehicle backfiring, and nothing different really happening. What it was the crack of a rifle. Most witnesses recalled hearing 3 distinct shots. The first shot fired hit a waving Kennedy through his upper back. It would penetrate through his neck, damaging several spinal vertebrae, before finally hitting the top of his right lung and exiting through his throat. He raised his elbows, clenched his fists in front of his face, and leaned forward. Jackie, not knowing what was happening, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. It is believed, in what has come to be known as the single bullet theory, that round also hit Governor Connolly in the back after exiting Kennedy. The limousine then made its way in front of the John Neely Bryan North pergola, where a second shot rang out as the limousine was passing the grassy knoll, which was to the north of Elm Street. It was determined that this second shot struck Kennedy and would eventually be the kill shot, hitting him in the rear of his head. This shot blew blood and fragments of Kennedy's scalp, brain, and skull all over the interior of the car. It was so powerful that blood and fragments also hit the car behind the president's. One of the Secret Service agents riding behind Kennedy, Clint Hill, stated that he heard one shot and ran forward to the president's vehicle, jumping on the trunk in order to protect Kennedy. As he was trying to make his way there, he heard the second shot, only 5 seconds after he heard the first. Jackie, confused and terrified, climbed onto the back of the limousine, but was ordered back into her seat by Hill. The presidential limo sped out of Dealey Plaza en route to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Jackie already knew her husband was gone. "They have killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand." The entire way to Parkland, she tried comforting him. Jack, can you hear me? I love you, Jack." She tried as best as she could to hold him, trying to comprehend what was happening, and as she would later tell, also trying to keep his brains in. It would later be determined that the governor, John Connolly, was also shot through the chest. It was only because of his wife pulling him onto her lap that the way he was resting ended up closing the wound, helping to limit the damage from the sucking chest wound as his right lung collapsed. As the presidential motorcade was speeding towards Parkland Hospital, the scene at Dealey Plaza was chaotic. Police officers and spectators stormed the grassy knoll, but found no evidence of the assailant. Others in the area would contribute to trying to understand where the shots came from. Lee Bowers, a spectator in the local railroad switch tower, noticed two men standing between the pergola and a fence. This would have been a good vantage point for the shots, and that there was no one behind the fence. James Tague, another spectator very close to the motorcade, recalled being stung in the face during the procession. He believed that this was from the second shot. The best tip the police received was from Howard Brennan, a steam fitter who happened to be sitting across the street from the school book depository. He heard the crack of a weapon come from above, and then his eyes locked onto the subject. He watched as the gunman fired for a second time with his rifle from a 6th floor window. He would later attest having witnessed the man in the window only a few moments before the attack. The police broadcasted Brennan's description of the assailant many times over the next few minutes. After the second shot rang out, Brennan told the police this man was aiming for his last shot and maybe paused for another second as though to ensure himself he hit his mark. The book depository theory was also confirmed by two employees who were watching the procession from the southeast corner of the building's 5th floor. As they were so close, one of the employees reported hearing 3 gunshots ring out and the resulting drop of cartridges on the floor above. The police sealed off all exits of the book depository between 12:33 and 12:50. All in all, there were 104 ear witnesses to the shots. Slightly more than half heard the shots come from the depository. About 31% believed it was from the grassy knoll, or even the triple underpass. Others believed that it was from one or the other, while about 3% believed that the shots came from both locations. An employee of the book depository named Buell Wesley Frazier drove into work that morning with another employee named Lee Harvey Oswald. That morning, Oswald brought with him a long brown paper bag, which he told Frazier was curtain rods. After Oswald was reported missing from the repository by his supervisor, the police put out a broadcast reporting Oswald as a suspect in the shooting. Oswald was located in the neighborhood of Oak Cliff, about 3 miles from Dealey Plaza, by police officer J.D. Tippett. Tippett called Oswald over to his police vehicle for a conversation. After a brief talk, Tippett got out of his car and was shot 4 times by Oswald. After emptying every bullet he had into Tippett, Oswald fled the scene. While this was unfolding, the police located the brown bag described by Frazier near the 6th floor window. The marks inside the bag were consistent with that of a rifle that was about 38 inches long. After Oswald fled the scene, he was noticed ducking into the entrance of a store and was then witnessed walking into the Texas Theater without buying a ticket. When the ticket clerk was made aware of what happened, they phoned the police. The police arrived and apprehended Oswald inside the theater. Oswald didn't give up without a fight, however, and was reported to have resisted arrest. He made an attempt to grab his pistol, but was subdued and restrained. Later that evening, he was charged with the murders of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippett. Oswald's complaint is that he was being made a patsy for time spent living in the Soviet Union. On the 6th floor of the book depository, Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman and Deputy Sheriff Eugene Boone were able to locate the murder weapon, an Italian Carcano M91 38 bolt-action rifle. The rifle was later confirmed as the murder weapon from photographs taken from Oswald's home, showing him posing with it. In the photographs, there was also a notch on the stock that could faintly be seen, matching that which is on the murder weapon. After investigation, it was discovered Oswald purchased the rifle using the name A. Hidell, and it was delivered to a post office box he was renting in Dallas. Other evidence tying the rifle to Oswald was the finding of a partial palm print on the barrel and a few fibers in the crevice of the rifle matching the shirt he was wearing that day. Over the next 12 hours, Oswald was questioned about the assassination of Jack Kennedy. He denied any involvement in the event. There were no recordings made of the interrogation, and only basic notes were ever taken, although many reports of the questioning were put together from both the Dallas Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Oswald wasn't very forthcoming with information. When confronted with evidence to his involvement, he had no explanation and would turn to false statements. Kennedy's motorcade arrived to Parkland Hospital for emergency medical treatment. Arriving with vital signs absent, Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. He was administered last rites by Catholic priest Father Oscar Huber. JFK's death certificate, which was completed the following day, stated that his personal physician, George Berkeley, who had arrived just 5 minutes after the motorcade, stated he was informed by members of the Secret Service that Kennedy was still breathing when he arrived. But when the priest saw JFK's body, he knew that was impossible. 30 minutes following his pronounced death, the White House made the announcement. Kennedy's body was removed from Parkland Hospital by the Secret Service. After a brief scuffle with the Dallas coroner, they were able to take it away. Just after 2 p.m., the body was taken to Love Field and loaded onto Air Force One. At 2:38 p.m., flanked by Jacqueline Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States, and he was administered the oath of office by Judge Sarah Hughes. Air Force One then departed Love Field. An autopsy was performed that evening at the request of Jackie. It took place at a naval hospital, as JFK had once been a naval officer during the Second World War. His funeral was held on the 25th of November at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, attended by approximately 1,200 guests from over 90 countries. He was interred at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia following the funeral. The day before the president's funeral, Oswald was being escorted to a vehicle in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters, where he would be transported to the county jail. Out of the crowd stepped a man named Jack Ruby, the owner of a Dallas nightclub, and shot Lee Harvey Oswald. This was witnessed by the world on live television. While he was unconscious, Oswald was driven to Parkland Hospital and pronounced dead at 1:07 p.m. The death of Oswald was confirmed on national television broadcast by Police Chief Jesse Curry, with the cause of death being a gunshot wound to the chest. Jack Ruby was immediately arrested for shooting Oswald, claiming he was deeply upset by Kennedy's death and wanted to spare Mrs. Kennedy the discomfort of coming back to trial. This would cause the start of the unraveling of Kennedy's death. As most of the media were awaiting the arrival of the motorcade to the Dallas Trade Mart, those who were traveling with the president were at the back of the motorcade, so that shooting was not shown on television. There were approximately 33 photographers who were at Dealey Plaza on the day of the murder, the most famous of which was a man named Abraham Zapruder. Zapruder captured Kennedy's assassination and the immediate aftermath. This famous silent movie has been given the name the Zapruder film. Other notable works from the event were retrieved from Orville Nix, Mary Muchmore, and Charles Bronson, although no other work has the close distance that Zapruder's did. It can be seen in many of the other recordings that were taken that there is a lady who appears to be standing and taking footage of the motorcade around the time of the assassination. She has never been discovered, and only given the name the Babushka Lady. The organization that was established in the wake of the assassination was named the Warren Commission, headed by United States Chief Justice Earl Warren. Many people who were named to the commission had no desire to take part, fearing that it would only throw gasoline on the fire and ultimately generating more controversy. Their report on the events would consist of an 888-page document, which was presented to the President Lyndon Johnson on the 24th of September in 1964. It was the determination of the commission that Lee Harvey Oswald was determined to have acted alone and fired 3 bullets. Also, Jack Ruby acted independently in his assassination of Oswald. Other committees were established following the completion of the document from the Warren Commission. The Rockefeller and Church Commissions were both established to investigate the events, making use of information from the FBI, CIA, and the Zapruder film. One of the more fascinating things to emerge from the Church Commission was the possibility that senior officials of both the FBI and CIA made conscious decisions not to disclose important information. From this, paired with a growing public skepticism surrounding the Warren Commission's findings, was the creation of the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations in September of 1976. Their first orders of business were to investigate the assassinations of both John F. Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. It would be through the HSCA that the first inkling of conspiracy was born. The committee determined that JFK was assassinated as the result of a spiraling conspiracy. One of their key pieces of information was the analysis of police channel recordings taken the day of Kennedy's assassination. The HSCA believed that the other committee investigations were both thorough and accurate. However, they failed to investigate a potential conspiracy due to the varying degrees of competency displayed by the FBI and CIA. Those two organizations didn't share the full spectrum of information they possessed with the Warren Commission. Rather than being entirely forthcoming with their entire repertoire, they would only make responses to select requests coming from the Commission. They also determined that the Secret Service didn't make use of the information at their disposal and was ultimately unprepared to defend the president. The Department of Justice believed that there didn't exist enough evidence of a conspiracy to push forward with a theory. The majority of findings were released to the public. However, many documents still remain sealed by U.S. Congress until at least 2029. After the HSCA completed their investigation, the case evaded public interest until 1992. The release of the movie JFK brought the case back into the spotlight. It was of such interest that Congress would pass the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, or, as it's more commonly known, the JFK Act. This would make all documentation available publicly, save for the documents that were sealed by acts of Congress. With this was also the creation of the Assassination Records Review Board. The ARRB unsealed 60,000 documents and made them public. All of these documents totaled over 4 million pages of information. A further 29,420 records were fully or partially released. However, some information was redacted. A report emerged from the AARB stating that they contested the photographs of JFK's brain and the fact that they were not his. JFK's kill shot hit his head and caused a great amount of damage, as attested to by Jackie. Many witnesses even stated they witnessed massive damage to the back of JFK's head, which the photographs do not rightly show. As of the 26th of October, 2021, all records with respect to the JFK assassination have been made public, again, exception of the ones sealed until 2029. Now, this is where the episode shifts focus to the various conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination of Jack Kennedy. As once stated by author John C. McAdams, the greatest and grandest of all conspiracy theories is the Kennedy assassination. The public is divided by those who agree with the findings of the Warren Commission, being pro-conspiracy or being debunkers, and then those who are anti-Warren. The central figure to many of these conspiracy theories is the assailant, Lee Harvey Oswald. According to CIA intercepted phone calls, someone impersonating Oswald had made various calls and visits to the embassies of Cuba and the USSR and Mexico, even as recently as the weeks leading up to the assassination. This would become one of the most closely guarded pieces of information the CIA had. The phone calls, confirming that the imposter was not Lee Harvey Oswald, were outlined in the analysis completed by Director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. The majority of conspiracy theories are centered on inconsistencies in investigation. Oversight, exclusion of evidence, errors, changing of stories, or even witnesses changing their testimony seem to point towards a cover-up. Many fingers point at the Warren Commission. The first black mark against them was that they only used information from the FBI that would support their theory. The theory that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No other shooters, spotters, conspirators, no one, just Oswald. One issue with this, as presented by famed news anchor Walter Cronkite, was that the Warren Commission also permitted the CIA and FBI to conduct their own independent investigations which, rather than working together, cast a shadow over the entire process. The issue with these investigations was that with the CIA and FBI providing their evidence to the Warren Commission, they report directly to the government through other senior officials. It's possible that the government, or even the organizations themselves, pushed their cover-up. The key purpose of the Warren Commission was really to act on behalf of the public, feeding them a testament of their own investigation to bring the temperature down. If there were, in fact, a cover-up pushed forward, then it would implicate many high-ranking government officials, such as the Chief Justice, the heads of the Democratic and Republican parties, the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, and many members of the armed forces, and even the White House. The first piece of this we'll examine were the reports of witness intimidation, and in some cases, even death. An eyewitness named Jean Hill made reports that there were attempts made against her to humiliate, discredit, and even intimidate her to changing her testimony. She filed reports of abuse by members of the Secret Service, harassment by the FBI, and even death threats from unnamed officials. There were also complaints against the Warren Commission, such that if witnesses were treading toward an explanation of anything other than Oswald acting alone, that interviews would be cut short. Other individuals have come forward claiming witness intimidation, such as Richard Carr, Akilah Clements, Sandy Speaker, and A.J. Milliken. If there wasn't enough of a plausible theory that witnesses were intimidated, Joe Molina, an eyewitness who worked at the book depository, was interrogated by authorities and subsequently fired from his job soon after. Ed Hoffman, another witness, claimed to have been intimidated by FBI agents directly, stating that he might get killed if he came forward with what he saw at Dealey Plaza. When it comes to the deaths of witnesses, one of the key conspiracy theories centers on the articles of journalist Penn Jones Jr. His belief was that 6 men gathered in Jack Ruby's apartment the night after he shot Oswald, 3 of whom, reporters Jim Cotha and Bill Hunter, as well as Ruby's first attorney Tom Howard, were described as mysterious and suspicious. Those 3 men would eventually be killed under suspicious circumstances, in addition to a further 7 in the 3 years following Kennedy's assassination. In 1989, another list would be published about a further 103 people who were believed to have suffered convenient deaths, who had been involved with the investigation of the Warren Commission. Reporter Dorothy Kilgallen was reported to have spoken with Jack Ruby while he was undergoing trial. She may or may not have received sensitive information about the assassination plot and would eventually be found dead in her apartment in Manhattan only 2 months later. Her death was caused by a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. Her death has been labeled the most prominent and mysterious among conspiracy theorists. Like Kilgallen, there is another high-profile case of a witness death, that of Rose Cheramy. Reports emerged that Louisiana State Police Lieutenant Francis Fruga traveled to the town of Eunice to pick up Cheramy, who had been hit by a car. When they drove to the hospital, she was believed to have told him that she was heading to Dallas with 2 members who resembled Italians. They were heading there to pick up some money, her baby, and to kill Kennedy. This could be taken as the ramblings of a madwoman, as she was being taken to the state hospital to treat her alcohol and heroin addictions. When Fruga tried to bring this forward to his captain, William Fritz, he was informed that the captain wasn't interested in hearing what he said. One of Cheramy's physicians, Dr. Victor Weiss, told the HSCA that 3 days after the assassination, she knew President Kennedy was going to be killed. Rose informed her doctor that she worked for Jack Ruby and had learned of Kennedy's assassination plot from people in the underworld. A few years later, Cheramy was found dead in Texas, having seemingly been run over by a car. The HSCA would even investigate the complaint that a statistically improbable number of individuals with some direct or peripheral association with the Kennedy assassination died as a result of that assassination, thereby raising the specter of conspiracy. When the chief of research testified, they determined, "Our final conclusion on the issue is that the available evidence does not establish anything about the nature of these deaths, which would indicate that the deaths were in some manner, either direct or peripheral, caused by the assassination of President Kennedy, or by any aspect of the subsequent investigation." Much like the witness intimidation and suppression of witness testimony, there was also the suppression of evidence. One example is the idea of a second shooter from the grassy knoll. Several eyewitnesses gave testimony that they noticed smoke in the vicinity of the knoll, and one who even smelled gunpowder. The Warren Commission ignored the testimonies of those who noticed the events from the Triple Underpass and noticed the second shooter on the knoll. With respect to the Zapruder film, the Babushka lady came forward, a woman named Beverly Oliver, claiming that it was her in the film. She made claims that, after the shooting, she was contacted by 2 men she believed were FBI or Secret Service. They wanted her to hand over the film she had taken, wanting to make a copy and return it within 10 days. The film was never returned, although a court order would later state that her descendants were to be paid the sum of $621,000 per second for each second of the 25-second film. And of course, as previously mentioned, there are also the documents that are sealed until 2029, and those that have been released are almost totally redacted, citing potential national security concerns. Like witness testimony, Evidence is also the key piece that needs to be examined. With respect to the photographs, the backyard photo of Oswald with his Carcano rifle was determined to be real and undoctored. However, the photo showing the damage to Kennedy's head is believed to have been doctored to hide the involvement of a second shooter. The Zapruder film was believed to be the single most important record of the assassination. It is claimed to have been sophisticatedly doctored, owing to unusual jerkiness in the movement and changing of focus. That being said, the film has also been independently authenticated as genuine and undoctored. One of the bigger ideas surrounding the Kennedy assassination was that Oswald didn't act alone, and there may have been a second shooter, if not an entire, tangled spiderweb of co-conspirators. One of the most highly suspected co-conspirators is Everett Howard Hunt Jr., a CIA agent and the man who was the burglar during the Watergate incident. There was belief that Hunt was in Dallas on the day of the assassination and may have been involved with the killing. In 2007, a deathbed confession was taken and released by Hunt's son. Hunt attested to have been a bench warmer during the plot and would even name various high-ranking CIA agents that were involved. The most remarkable name put forward as a co-conspirator by Hunt was that of the president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. There wasn't much evidence in the way of this, however, and the confession was met with a wave of skepticism. Even the slain police officer, J.D. Tippit, was believed to be involved in the plot. There was the belief that he was originally sent to kill Oswald, and as he was leaving, Oswald killed him in self-defense. There's also a possibility that Tippit wasn't killed in self-defense, but silenced by other co-conspirators for having set up Oswald. This theory actually goes pretty deep, and if you're interested in reading further, I highly suggest you look into it. Now that we've set the stage in the retelling of the historical event and examined some of the Warren Commission's findings and some of the other questions surrounding aspects of the investigation, we can truly dive into the conspiracies. As there are many, we'll discuss some of the bigger ones in this episode. The first we'll look into is known as the New Orleans Conspiracy. The man credited with developing this theory was a district attorney in New Orleans named Jim Garrison. Garrison's theory was largely centric to the case in which he persecuted Clay Shaw, a local businessman believed to have been involved in the assassination plot. The largest drawback to Garrison's theory was that many different parts of it changed so often that it was mocked by the media. Garrison's theory was summarized by Pamela Koloff and Michael Hall in the publication Texas Monthly, reading as follows. There is a secret government within our government, a cabal that in 1963 ordered the murder of a popular president, set up a patsy, and installed its own puppet, and orchestrated an elaborate cover-up that included tampering with the corpse, destroying and suppressing evidence, and killing witnesses. Heading the cabal were some of the world's most powerful men, rich and corrupt industrialists, generals, and right-wing politicians. Down below was an eclectic group of mobsters, spooks, lowlifes, and anti-Castro extremists, many of whom were headquartered at 544 Camp Street in New Orleans, including Oswald, former FBI agent Guy Bannister, soldier of fortune David Ferry, and suspected CIA informant Clay Shaw. Together, in the summer of 1963, they plotted Kennedy's demise. Shortly after Kennedy was assassinated, the previous movements of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans generated a great amount of intrigue. Only 3 days after the assassination, a New Orleans attorney named Dean Andrews informed the FBI that he received a call from a man named Clay Bertrand, who pleaded with him to defend Oswald. This was confirmed in the investigation by the Warren Commission. Later that month, an employee of a local private investigation firm named Jack Martin made a complaint that a fellow employee, David Ferry, was a co-conspirator in the Kennedy plot. He stated that Ferry told him of the plans to kill Kennedy and even believed Ferry taught Oswald how to shoot through a telescopic sight. Ferry, of course, would deny this allegation, even though the pair knew one another from their time spent with the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol. In 1963, Ferry and Bannister were working for a lawyer named G. Ray Gill. One of Gill's clients was the city's mafia boss Carlos Marcello. On the afternoon of the 22nd of November, the day of Kennedy's assassination, Bannister and Jack Martin were drinking at a local bar. On their return to work, they got into an argument. Martin at one point yelled at him, "What are you gonna do? Kill me like you killed Kennedy?" Bannister beat Martin horribly with the butt end of his Magnum revolver. Oswald, at this time, was involved with the New York Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro organization. He would be actively involved in the organization, sometimes at his own expense, handing out many leaflets. Around the corner from the Newman building that Oswald lived in, which also houses the Cuban Revolutionary Council, was the offices of Guy Bannister and Associates. This was a private investigations agency run by Guy Bannister. They were also involved with anti-Castro practices in the area. Due to this proximity, the HSCA began to dive into the potential relationship between Oswald and Bannister. Though they couldn't interview Bannister as he had passed away in 1964, they were able to interview his brother Ross. Ross Bannister would tell them that his brother mentioned witnessing Oswald handing out leaflets on more than one occasion. Bannister's secretary, Delphine Roberts, stated that Oswald even dropped into the office on one occasion to fill out an agent application form. The HSCA, however, were unable to ascertain the validity of her statement. 1966 would bring a new investigation into the Kennedy assassination, spearheaded by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Garrison purported that the hit was carried out by a group of right-wing extremists in concert with David Ferry and Guy Bannister, incorporating the potential involvement of some agents from within the CIA. The motive was unadulterated anger at Kennedy's attempts to gain peace with both Cuba and Vietnam. Garrison also believed that Clay Shaw, under the guise of Clay Bertrand, was also involved, and the trio of conspirators would eventually set up Oswald to be a patsy. On the 1st of March, 1967, Garrison arrested Shaw for conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. However, 1.5 years later, at Shaw's trial, he was found not guilty. The end of the New Orleans conspiracy theory leads directly into our next, the CIA conspiracy. This theory is founded on the idea that Oswald was a CIA agent, to some effect within the organization. The Warren Commission, however, would later conclude that Oswald was never employed in any capacity by the CIA, also confirmed by the HSCA at a later time. The curious piece coming out of this was from one of the HSCA's investigators, Gaetan Fonzi, who stated that the HSCA was pressured not to look into the relationship between Oswald and the CIA. He began to draw connections between CIA agent David Phillips, using the pseudonym Maurice Bishop, and Oswald, stating that the two were connected through anti-Castro circles. It wouldn't be until 1995 when former Army intelligence and NSA executive assistant John Newman would state that the CIA and FBI deliberately tampered with the files they had on Oswald both before and after the assassination took place. Information was withheld from authorities in Dallas that might have alerted them to Oswald's presence and the fact that he potentially posed a threat. Newman's theory held that it was the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, James Angleton, who was the central figure to the assassination plot. He was the only one who possessed the access, authority, and the ingenious mind to manage a plot as sophisticated as this. With this also came a second name, Allen Dulles, the former CIA director who was also a member of the Warren Commission. What's interesting about Dulles was his motive, anger with Kennedy for having been dismissed after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1977, the FBI would release 40,000 files pertaining to the assassination of Kennedy. Among those was a memorandum from the 3rd of April, 1967, written by Deputy Director Cartha DeLoach. The memo stated that Lyndon Johnson was informed by J. Edgar Hoover that the CIA had generated a plan to kill Fidel Castro. That document reads as follows. Marvin Watson, the advisor to President Johnson, called me late last night and stated that the president had told him, in an off moment, that he was now convinced there was a plot in connection with the Kennedy assassination. Watson stated that the president felt the CIA had something to do with the plot. DeLoach would later state that he believed all of this was pure speculation, and the matter never went any further. Like the New Orleans conspiracy, the CIA conspiracy also leads us into our next. Who could possibly have been the most suspicious and had the most to gain from the demise of Kennedy? President Lyndon Baines Johnson. In 2003, approximately 20% of Americans believed that Lyndon Johnson was involved with the Kennedy assassination. Those who criticized the Warren Commission's findings believed that Johnson disliked Jack and Jackie Kennedy and believed that Johnson was going to be dropped from the Democratic Party ticket in the upcoming election of 1964. The first idea of Johnson's involvement came from the 1966 book Forgive My Grief, written by Penn Jones Jr. The book contains excerpts from a letter believed to have been written by Jack Ruby, naming the chief conspirator as Lyndon Baines Johnson. It would be in 1968's book, The Dark Side of Lyndon Baines Johnson, that author Joachim Jobsten would accuse the president of having some role in the assassination plot. He believed Johnson played the lead role and was connected in the plot with the FBI, CIA, Secret Service, and other members of high society in Dallas. Circling back to the Democratic ticket, it was believed JFK was going to name Terry Sanford, the governor of North Carolina, as his running mate in the '64 election. This, of course, would be motive enough for Johnson to want him gone. In 1968, Kennedy's personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, stated in her book, Kennedy and Johnson, that JFK informed her Johnson would be replaced as vice president. In a conversation that took place on the 19th of November, 1963, she made the following recording in her diary. As Mr. Kennedy sat on the rocker in my office, his head resting on its back, he placed his left leg across his right knee. He rocked slightly as he talked. In a slow, pensive voice, he said to me, "You know, if I am elected in '64, I'm going to spend more and more time toward making government service an honorable career. I would like to tailor the executive and legislative branches of government so that they can keep up with the tremendous strides and progress being made in other fields. I am going to advocate changing of some of the outmoded rules and regulations in the Congress, such as the seniority rule. To do this, I'll need a running mate in the '64, a man who believes as I do." Mrs. Lincoln went on to write, "I was fascinated by this conversation and wrote it down verbatim in my diary. Now, I asked, 'Who is your choice as a running mate?' He looked straight ahead, and without hesitating, he replied, At this time, I'm thinking about Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina, but it will not be Lyndon. Madeline Brown, a mistress of Johnson, would also implicate the president in the conspiracy. She stated in 1997 that Johnson, along with Haroldson Hunt Jr., a friend, an oil tycoon, began planning the assassination as early as 1960. The conspiracy, by 1963, had grown to involve dozens of people intricately woven into the FBI and the mafia. Also, many prominent politicians and journalists. A social event at the home of Texas oil baron Clint Murchison was held the night before the assassination. This event was attended by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Presidential Advisor John McClory, future President Richard Nixon, entrepreneur George Brown, Dallas Mayor Robert Thornton, and Haroldson Hunt. When Johnson arrived at the event later in the evening, he informed Brown that the Kennedys would never embarrass him again, and that it was no threat. It was a promise. She would even state he met her on New Year's Eve in 1963, where he confirmed the conspiracy to kill Kennedy in concert with the Fat Cats of Texas and U.S. intelligence. A few years later, she was joined in the filming of the documentary Evidence of Revision, where many other former Johnson associates also stated their suspicions of LBJ. In an interview done with Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who was a surgical resident that treated Oswald after he was shot by Ruby, stated he received a call from President Johnson while he was treating Oswald. The president demanded to know Oswald's status and wanted a deathbed confession from the assassin. Crenshaw relayed the message to Dr. Shires, but stated that Oswald was in no condition to give any form of statement. The only issue here is that in his schedule, Lyndon Johnson was in his limousine at the time of the call, and there was no record of it being routed through the White House's switchboard. Not that that would stop a destruction of that record from covering its tracks anyway. Historian Michael Kurtz would eventually come forward stating that no evidence existed that Johnson was involved in the conspiracy, but confirmed that the events may have been covered up. He believed the chief conspiracist was Fidel Castro. When it was discovered by the Johnson administration, they had covered it up, fearing any action taken against Cuba may escalate into nuclear war with the Soviet Union. This, of course, also lends credibility to a Cuba-Castro theory owing to Oswald's ties to Cuba. However, Castro would refute this theory himself in a 1977 interview, effectively stating that provoking the United States into conflict would have only brought destruction to his country, and that no one who wasn't insane would have thought about killing Kennedy. Decades later, Castro believed that there were those in the United States government who believed Kennedy to be a traitor for not having invaded Cuba when he had the chance, and that he was never forgiven for it. Our second last theory we'll cover is known as the Secret Service conspiracy. The HSCA would draw the conclusion that the Secret Service was not involved in the assassination plot, but they were deficient in the performance of their duties. The HSCA concluded the following three things. 1. President Kennedy did not receive adequate protection in Dallas. 2. The Secret Service possessed information that was not properly analyzed, investigated, or used by the Secret Service in connection with the president's trip to Dallas. And 3. The Secret Service agents in the motorcade were inadequately prepared to protect the president from a sniper. They would note specifically, no actions were taken by the agent in the right front seat of the presidential limousine, Roy Kellerman, to cover the president with his body. Although it would have been consistent with Secret Service procedure for him to have done so, the primary function of the agent was to remain at all times in close proximity to the president in the event of such emergencies. There does exist, however, the belief that Kennedy may have asked the Secret Service to be more discreet during the visit. However, this remains highly disputed. When the limousine's driver Sam Kennedy was interviewed, he stated that the ideas, such as removing the bubble top of the limo, not having agents positioned beside the rear bumper, and reducing the number of Dallas police motorcycle riders, were not made by Kennedy. Even Abraham Bolden, the first African American on the Secret Service, stated that he overheard other agents say that they wouldn't protect Kennedy from an assassin. When the records of the Secret Service were requested by Congress as part of the JFK Act, it was found that the Secret Service had destroyed all protective survey reports that covered JFK's trips in 1963, between the 24th of September and the 9th of November. The last conspiracy theory we'll cover in this episode is the organized crime conspiracy. In 1964, the Warren Commission discovered no further evidence of conspiracy pertaining to Ruby's killing of Oswald. They determined that there was no involvement between Ruby and other members of organized crime, and that Ruby himself was not involved in any sort of organized criminal operations. In 1979, the HSCA would determine that there was no involvement of any bodies of organized crime in the assassination, but it did not preclude individual members of any organizations from possibly have taken part. The chief counsel of the HSCA, Robert Blakely, would state in his book he believed all signs pointed to the New Orleans Mafia boss, Carlos Marcello, as having been behind the assassination plot, having had the means and opportunity to carry out the hit. He believed that Ruby was involved to some degree in relationships with Joseph Savello and Joe Campisi, the top two men in the Dallas Mafia. He noted that Campisi and Ruby were close friends, often seen dining together at the Egyptian Lounge, a restaurant Campisi owned even as recent as the night before the assassination. Campisi was even connected to Marcello, as each Christmas he sent 260 pounds of Italian sausage to Marcello in some sort of tribute, and records even existed that he called New Orleans, sometimes as much as 20 times a day. Some government documents also outline members of the Mafia working with the CIA on other assassination attempts, such as the plotted hit on Fidel Castro. This plot would bring together ex-FBI, now CIA agent Robert Mayhew and a member of the Chicago mob, Johnny Roselli. Mayhew offered to pay $150,000 to have Castro killed, which was declined by Roselli. In turn, Roselli would introduce him to Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante, mafia bosses in Tampa, Florida, and pre-revolution Cuba, respectively. This was due to the Cuban Revolution toppling a regime friendly to the United States, making the CIA desperate to dispose of him. The Kennedys were not popular, both within the government and organized criminal circles. Jack was unpopular in government due to the aforementioned failure to capitalize on an attack on Cuba. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, the current Attorney General, was in the midst of an unprecedented legal assault on organized crime. They felt as though they were kicked to the curb, having previously worked with Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, to get him elected. Thus, it was believed Carlos Marcello planned the hit on JFK in order to throw off his brother from his legal crusade. Information was released in 2006 through a transistor radio tap by the FBI that Marcello organized Kennedy's assassination, and that the FBI covered up the fact they had this information in their possession. Some would even implicate the entire trio of Marcello, Trafficante, and even Jimmy Hoffa in the assassination plot, with the number of out-of-state calls made by Ruby to associates of these three bosses in the months leading up to the assassination and Ruby's confession in prison. this conspiracy theory effectively tying other organized crime and the government together. In truth, we may never know what happened in the days or months leading up to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. These are simply some of the vast conspiracy theories surrounding the event. It is possible there may have been a vast, tangled web of conspirators breaking the bounds of social standing and even national borders. It may have been that John F. Kennedy, as loved as he was by the people, was not well liked by those in government or other organizations. It's also entirely possible that Lyndon Johnson wanted him dead, feeling slighted and embarrassed by the Kennedys. Truly, any number of conspirators could exist, and theories include anywhere ranging from Johnson, the FBI, the CIA, local Texas organizations, anti-Castro Cubans, Soviets, and many more. It's possible that we may never know, that his family may never get to know. But as with everything, somewhere in all of this is more than conspiracy. Somewhere in it all lies the truth. To close, in the words of John F. Kennedy himself,
"A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on."
With this, we draw to close the story of the assassination of American President John F. Kennedy and the spawning of the many conspiracy theories that have left a shadow cast over the event. There is a lot to unpack here, and I'll be back with you on Thursday for my thoughts on the event as a whole in our first episode of Dark Reflections. Due to time constraints on our hosting website, this will only be posted to our Facebook and YouTube pages. So ensure, like the podcast's main episodes, you're subscribed and that you check there on Thursdays to hear my thoughts. There are still many conspiracy theories surrounding this that we haven't covered, and only a small portion were found in this episode. There are many more to discover, should you wish to go looking for them. I wanted to take a moment and dedicate this episode to my mother, as I know it's her favorite historical event outside of what happened to Princess Diana. So Mom, this one's for you. Before you go, remember to subscribe so you don't miss any of our amazing episodes coming up, such as our episode next week, where we'll tell the story of true crime's Romeo and Juliet, the tragic tale of Bonnie and Clyde. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week, and thank you for listening.